In February of 2025 at MagicCon Chicago, nearly 200 competitors took part in the first ever officially sanctioned tournament for Magic: The Gathering's weirdest format, Dandân. Graded copies of the format's namesake card were given out as prizes, and in the finals, one of the competitors was very clear about their intentions of taking a bite out of their Dandân, chewing and swallowing that bite, and then having the card professionally graded once again. Objectively, this is hilarious. Less hilarious, though, were this person's repeated digs at the Dandân format throughout that final game. While making the finals is impressive and means that we should absolutely take the substance of this person's critiques seriously, in the moment, it was disrespectful. This was a trial run for something new. Organizers had clearly bent over backwards to make this event happen, and they were all there watching this final round unfold. To repeatedly complain about how bad the format is directly in front of these organizers after they had put in 3 consecutive 12-hour days in the basement of a convention center for your entertainment is rude. In the finals, this person did wind up losing to a gracious and sporting opponent whose full attention was on the game itself. Tactfulness aside, I understand the substance of this person's critiques. Dandân is Magic's weirdest format, first and foremost because players use a shared deck. More traditional formats of Magic have metagames defined by deck archetypes. Before a tournament, one decides which archetype they will play, and that archetype will have good matchups and bad matchups over the course of the event. In a sense, then, tournament Magic, as we've known it for 3 decades, is just very complicated rock, paper, scissors. Aggro beats control, control beats combo, combo beats aggro. If you anticipate, for example, a tournament metagame to be disproportionately combo, it may be smart to register a control deck with a sideboard plan for your weakness, aggro. As a shared deck format, however, Dandân loses all of this texture. Drawing from the same deck, the only axes for games to hinge on are player skill and random chance. At the end of a 200-person tournament, it's safe to assume that remaining players will play very close to optimally. With player skill essentially equal, the only axis for determining a winner is random chance. In this Dandân tournament, the card that most frequently turned games into a coin flip was Accumulated Knowledge, with 4 copies in the deck. Resolving this with 2 or 3 copies already in the graveyard often generated game-winning card advantage. While I understand the potential that the designers see in this card, the ability to draw 4 cards at once is too much in an environment where scratching for every inch should be designed to matter. I would cut 2 of them so that they never draw more than 2 cards. The challenge for designers of shared deck formats is to build metagames in a can that are as decision-heavy and skill-testing as possible, allowing player skill to remain a relevant axis even at the highest levels of play. This tournament was hosted in partnership with the content creator Covert Go Blue, who has described Dandân as Magic's most chess-like format. And while I do think this captures the format's aspirations and that this deck is an excellent start, I do have constructive feedback. I signed up for this tournament before ever playing Dandân, or Forgetful Fish, as it is officially called. I didn't start out with any particular aspirations. Dandân just seemed like something unique to sink my attention into beyond more traditional convention fare of commander pods and draft. Plus, as I frequently point out, this format has my name written all over it. I was also meeting up with an old friend in Chicago, the man, the myth, the legend, John Mistretta. This tournament gave us an excuse to hop on Discord a few nights per week, grind Dandân, try to understand the format, and more importantly, to catch up and build hype before hanging out IRL. In my first ever game of Forgetful Fish, John tried something very weird. The only way to deal damage to your opponent in this format is with its namesake card, Dandân. Dandân, however, can't attack unless defending player controls an island. While 20 islands are the primary mana sources in the Forgetful Fish deck, they are not the deck's only mana sources. Among the deck's 80 cards are 12 lands without the type island. 2 of each of Halimar Depths, Is It Boilerworks, Lonely Sandbar, Remote Isle, Svaelia Knight's Temple, and Temple of Epiphany. Certainly, John was not the first to observe that until one plays an island, they will not face any combat pressure at all. Theoretically, one could play an entire game without playing an island, remaining invulnerable the whole time. The problem, of course, is Dandân's other text, when you control no islands, sacrifice Dandân. Without islands, John could not use the only card in the deck capable of dealing damage to me. At best, he had simply created a strange, temporary stalemate where I could play islands, he could not, and I gradually built a substantial resource advantage. Without a win condition, eventually, John pivoted to playing an island, then a Dandân, and applying combat pressure, but my resource advantage was too large, and I won easily. The whole time, I was certain John was nuts, but he approaches everything with a spirit of exploration, and would rather get his butt kicked than leave a single stone unturned, and that is awesome. We quickly decided that withholding islands was a cheeky tactic for corner cases that might save us an early turn or two of combat pressure, but not at all worth the resource disadvantage of committing to the idea through the mid-game, because while not dying was step 1 towards winning, at some point we would need to apply pressure of our own. Wouldn't we? Mystical Tutor is another card that I recommend removing from the tournament Dandân list, not for power reasons, but because tutors are strange in a shared deck format. As a player looks through the game's shared library, they have perfect information and can deduce every card in their opponent's hand. In a tournament, players absolutely should do this, except it takes too much time. I brought a boogie board to take notes on and always at least tallied the number of memory lapses in my opponent's hand, but didn't take time to do much more because of rules about slow play. Some players use a rule that opponents reveal their hand when Mystical Tutor resolves, which would fix this, but short of changing the rules for tutors, they just aren't well suited for this format at a tournament rules enforcement level. Maybe a month into playtesting with John, I drew a hand that reminded me of his strategy in our first game ever. I don't remember exactly what it was, but something like Halimar Depths, 2 Is It Boilerworks, and Vision Charm, plus other cards. I realized that I could get all the way to 5 mana without playing an island, wait literally like 30 turns, probably do some stuff along the way, but ultimately use Vision Charm's Mill 4 mode to force John to draw from an empty library, causing him to lose the game. I later figured out that Vision Charm isn't quite the right idea, as it's not such a reliable knockout punch in a format that is literally 10% memory lapses. But often enough, and in this case, it did work, and it rocked our understanding of how we were going to approach this tournament. We ran it back multiple times that night, and with some practice, found the no island strategy to be somewhat consistent, even when our opening hands weren't as perfectly sculpted. The biggest breakthrough was that we had the luxury of mulliganing extremely aggressively. Because we knew that we would not face any combat pressure all game long, we didn't need removal or blockers, and certainly not islands. The only thing an opening hand needed was 2 mana from any of the deck's 12 non-island lands. At one point in the tournament, I even mulliganed to 2 to find my lands. From there, I was in no hurry, perfectly content to refill my hand over the next many, many draw steps, knowing that I would not face any combat pressure in the meantime. While it's true that my opponent may have accumulated advantages in other ways by having more cards to look at early in the game, most opponents didn't realize what we were up to until we had already caught up. They may have assembled an army of Dandans, but who cares? If those fish can't attack us, we can forget the fish. Our understanding of this strategy has grown over time, including a great deal on the fly during the tournament itself. So this is not a tournament recap per se, so much as a guide to our forget the fish strategy as best as I understand it today. And the clearest I can be in explaining this involves going over every card in the deck. So let's start with dead cards. 34 out of the deck's 80 cards are completely dead to us. That's a full 42.5% of the deck that we cast aside, saying, don't need it. The only use these will ever be to us are as functionally blank cards that we can stack on top of the deck for opponents to draw and do nothing with. Mystic Sanctuary is the one exception. While useless to us, opponents may still leverage its enters trigger, so do exercise some caution there. In traditional Dandan, Crystal Spray and Mind Bend are functionally removal spells. Changing the text of Dandan to reference non-island land types puts its sacrifice trigger on the stack as soon as state-based actions are checked. With our strategy, though, removal spells are almost never necessary because without islands, again, we can't be attacked. Sometimes, before opponents realize our strategy, we can use these cards as bait for any memory lapses they may be holding, but usually we have other ideas. Most obviously, Crystal Spray draws a card at instant speed. This is very relevant in a shared deck format anytime any player manipulates the top of the deck. In the tournament, often I would target a land instead of a Dandan just to make sure my opponent couldn't kill their Dandan in response to counter the spell and deny me the card draw. Mind Bend doesn't draw a card, but it is just 1 mana, and it permanently rewrites its target to reference a new land type. It doesn't change back at the end of the turn. Technically, then, this allows us to play an island that we then immediately turn into a mountain. Through playtesting, though, we learned that in most cases, this is a very bad idea. All that it takes to crumple our strategy from there is another Mind Bend, or Crystal Spray, or Memory Lapse to leave us stuck with an island and usually immediately die to an army of Dandans. Our most common use case for Mind Bend actually happens at the very end of the game. Over the course of the late game, after we have enough mana under us, our goal is to sculpt a hand that allows us to avoid drawing from an empty library for as many turns as possible. The most common way to do this is through the combination of Memory Lapse and any instant with a legal target. The deck has many instants to choose from, but Mind Bend is tied for the best because it's just 1 mana and it always has a legal target. Opponents usually grew wise to our strategy at some point during the game, but almost never quite understood how those final turns would actually play out. More than once, I watched my opponent cast Vision Charm with a smug smile on their face, mill the final 4 cards of the library, and pass to me, expecting me to lose during my draw step. Instead, though, during my upkeep, I would cast Mind Bend, hold priority, and then cast Memory Lapse targeting my own Mind Bend. If that stack resolved, Mind Bend would go back on top and I would be safe. And even if my opponent had a Memory Lapse of their own, there was nothing they could target on that stack to change the situation. Whatever they successfully countered would still go on top. I would be safe, and the pressure would be back on them during their upkeep to address the, once again, empty library. At the end of most games, I had sculpted a hand with at least 3 layers of redundancy here. That is to say, I had resources in hand to survive for at least 3 turns with an empty library. In addition to Mind Bend, Unsubstantiate, and Vision Charm are cards with limited other uses, but for our strategy are most valuable at the very end of the game as targets for our own memory lapses. While Memory Lapse is a 2-card synergy with most instants to prevent death from an empty library, Metamorphose is the only card in the deck that can save us from an empty library all by itself by putting an opponent's land probably on top of the library at instant speed. As such, it is the single best card for our strategy in the late game. Metamorphose is also one of the best cards for our strategy early, as it can steal non-island lands from our opponents. Our top priority in the early and mid-game is getting our lands underneath us. The dream here is to hit an opponent's Izzet Boilerworks early, denying them 2 mana and giving us 2 more non-islands worth of mana in exchange for 1 useless fish they'll put in play from their hand. Honestly, I slept on this card for far too long, but by the end of the tournament, this was my MVP. As they relate to our Forget the Fish strategy, there's not too much to say about Accumulated Knowledge, Brainstorm, Mystical Tutor, Predict, or Mystic Retrieval. These are all very good cards that support our strategy the same way they support a traditional strategy by providing card advantage and selection. Not too much secret knowledge to memorize here. I will say, though, most of the time, it's best to wait on these until our opponent's end step. That way, if they cast Memory Lapse, we can calmly let that resolve, redraw the spell on our turn, and take another bite at the apple during our opponent's next end step. It's a rope-a-dope strategy through and through where patience pays off. Most traditional Dandân players would probably flag Dance of the Skywise as one of the least impactful cards in the deck, and they may be right, but funny enough, this card represents the only way to deal damage to us while we control no islands. John and I called this a DDoS attack, a DDoS attack, a Dandân Dance of the Skywise attack. And while I don't think that it is ultimately effective as counterplay, theoretically, an opponent could use this 5 times in a game for lethal damage, recurring it with Mystic Retrievals, Sanctuaries, and Diminishing Returns. I should also say that despite the aspirations of some of our more creative opponents, the interaction between Dandân, Dance of the Skywise, and Supplant Form does not quite work the way one might hope. I had to look this up before the tournament and call a judge multiple times during the tournament to explain this to my opponents. But if you resolve a Dance of the Skywise targeting a Dandân, turning it into a 4/4 dragon, and then target that dragon with Supplant Form, the creature token that you create will simply be a Dandân, as the changes created by Dance of the Skywise are not copyable values. Which is lucky for me, because I didn't realize this until pretty deep into our playtesting, and this strategy would absolutely fold to a single 4/4 dragon. The last card left to address is Diminishing Returns. There's a lot to unpack here, and our view of this effect as it relates to Forget the Fish changed quite a bit over time. I will also tease that this card led to the most thrilling and sublime moment in my 13 years of playing Magic the Gathering, alongside a first-of-its-kind judge ruling during an official tournament. Our strategy entered uncharted territory, creating new case law that will be used forever as precedent by Wizards of the Coast. But more on that later. Most of the time, functionally, this plays as a time twister, shuffling hands and graveyards back into the library and giving everyone a fresh grip of 7. The only differences are that Diminishing Returns exiles 10 random cards before new hands are dealt, and features the words up to, allowing players to draw fewer than 7 if that's their preference. Initially, John and I saw diminishing returns as a threat to our strategy. If the idea was to gradually sculpt a perfect hand over the course of a very long game, this just seemed like a reset button that gave us less time to accomplish that goal. It wasn't until the tournament itself that I began to see mid-game diminishing returns as often inevitable. So instead of fighting it to protect whatever memory lapses, metamorphoses, etc. that I was sandbagging for the game's final turns, I began embracing it and adjusted my early game strategy accordingly. Diminishing returns is an excellent way to dig for additional non-island land drops, and planning for a hand reset allows us to play cards more freely until that mid-game. These won't be the most impactful plays of the game by any stretch, but we may see 30 more draw steps before the end of the game and should have time to rebuild whatever hand we need. We might as well create a little motion, which helps hide our secret strategy. And don't underestimate the relevance of putting 10 cards in exile. That is public information, and eventually, between that, our hand, and our graveyard, we may notice, for example, that all 8 memory lapses are accounted for, and we don't have to worry about our spells being countered. Or, if we notice that all 10 Dandans are accounted for, along with any way to recur diminishing returns, we can actually begin playing islands because there's no way to get any Dandans back. Opponents were very polarized by our Forget the Fish strategy. Over 10 tournament rounds, I encountered both some of the kindest, most sporting and enthusiastic opponents I've ever had, and some of the exact opposite. There's certainly tension when a historically casual format is brought into a competitive environment. So while it would be absurd to apologize for any strategy used in a good faith effort to win a tournament within its rules, I do want to express some degree of empathy. We were the only people using this strategy, and nobody else really knew it was possible. So obviously, playing against this strategy is far from the experience my opponents thought they were signing up for when they paid very real money to enter the tournament. Forget the Fish is much more tolerable when both players realize that turns don't have to last longer than, 5 seconds. Untap, draw, end step, discard an island, and pass. I played that turn, I don't know how many times, literally probably hundreds of times. During one round, my opponent was newer to Magic and brand new to Dandan, and by the mid-game, their turns were taking a very long time. They didn't know how to crack my islandless fortress, and puzzling over it pushed us to 20 minutes left in the round. I knew that we had too much library to get through at this rate, so I did call a judge and turned around and privately told them that my turns were fast, my opponents were slow, and I was worried we'd run out of time. So the judge watched for a few turns and then issued a time warning that sent my opponent spiraling. From that point, I won very easily. My opponent stopped giving consideration to their plays entirely, and during the next round, I actually heard them scream from multiple tables over. So if you're watching this, I hope you're okay. I hope this gives some context about what I was doing, and I truly hope that you enjoyed the rest of your con. That win brought me to 2-0 on the day during Saturday's qualifying tournament. I had gone 3-2 on Friday and learned a lot in the process, but the day was a clean slate, and despite the uncomfortable judge call, I felt good going into round 3. That was against Cameron, who caught on to my strategy more quickly than any other opponent. I wish that I could rewatch the entire game because it was the best I've ever played of any format. His uncertainty about my strategy and my uncertainty about his adaptation to it made this game extremely rich. I was terrified that Cameron had quickly gone from, oh, what's he doing, to, oh, he's doing that, to, I should do that, to doing that better than me. He realized pretty early that this game was only going to be decided when one of us drew from an empty library. As we danced around this, trying to understand how to outflank the other, we must have cast diminishing returns 3 or 4 times, exiling a huge chunk of the deck. Eventually, there were just 23 cards left in our hands, graveyard, and library combined. When Cameron cast another diminishing returns, that number dropped to 22, and it opened an uncharted wormhole in the rules of Magic the Gathering. After shuffling everything together and exiling 10 cards, only 12 would remain to be dealt between us. We're each allowed to draw up to 7 cards, but if we both did, at least one of us would need to draw from an empty library. And hypothetically, if we both did, would it happen to one of us first? And would that matter? How exactly does this work in a shared deck format? We called a judge, who called another judge, who called another judge, and eventually we got a clear, if not complicated, answer. First, we shuffle everything together. Then we exile 10 cards face up. Armed with that knowledge, then the player who controls diminishing returns chooses a number up to 7. Then their opponent chooses a number up to 7. Then the player who controls diminishing returns deals a card to themselves and then a card to their opponent, alternating who is dealt to until each player reaches the number of cards that they chose. If a player would be dealt a card this way while the library is empty, when the spell resolves, they lose the game as soon as state-based actions are checked. If both players draw from a shared empty library this way, they lose the game simultaneously, and it is a draw. Mid-resolution of diminishing returns, the ball was in Cameron's court. 12 cards remained in the library, and he needed to choose a number. He chose 6, putting the action on me, and I had to take a second to think this through. I counted, and then counted again before locking in 5. Our cards were dealt, and when the dust settled, just 1 card remained in the library. My hope against hope was that Cameron would pass to me, I would draw the last card in the library, pass back to him, and he would lose on his draw step. Instead, though, still on the same turn, Cameron did the most unhinged thing I've ever seen in a game of Magic and cast diminishing returns again. At this point, there were 13 cards total in all relevant zones. We were talking about 12 cards a moment ago, but remember, the other copy of diminishing returns was still on the stack. When it resolved, it went into the graveyard. So that's +1 card, 12 + 1, 13. Apparently, Cameron's 6-card hand didn't have an answer, so this was his last best hope at digging for something else. We shuffled everything together, exiled 10 cards, and with 3 cards remaining, Cameron staked a claim for 2 of them. Again, I had to think for just a second here. If I chose 2 or more, I would draw from an empty library and lose. If I chose 1, that 1 card had better be Metamorphose, because without it, the library would be empty on my draw step. My only option was 0, leaving 1 card in the deck to get me through my draw step and hoping that neither of Cameron's cards could add or subtract exactly 1 card to or from the library. He drew his 2 cards. Passed to me. I drew the last card in the deck. It was an island. I held my breath. I passed back to Cameron. And when he offered the handshake, I about left my body. If Dandân is the chess of Magic, then this was my immortal game. Thrilling the whole time, often surprising, and as much a collaborative exploration of uncharted game space as it was a competition. With a win in the next round, I would be 4-0, punching my ticket to the top 8 finals on Sunday. Immediately, though, I just could not find non-island lands and mulliganed to 2. The hand I kept was Is It Boilerworks and an island, the idea being that it was okay to play an island on turn 1 as long as I bounced it back to my hand on turn 2, never to be played again. It wasn't great, but it was a plan, and all was going according to that plan until like turn 2 when my opponent used Metamorphose on the Boilerworks and just sent me to the Shadow Realm. While I committed to the strategy and never did play an island, I was top decking all game long and never got my mana under me. I still forced the game to be decided by decking, but my opponent had way more mana for way more memory lapses, and my aspirations of being Dandân World Champion were over. While I was out of contention for the top 4 who would move on, with a record of 3-1, a win in the final round would at least secure top 8 for this qualifier, earning a graded copy of Dandân that may not have been worth a ton of money, but in many ways is priceless. My opponent seemed nice enough, though may have been a little too pleased when I mulliganed down to 4. Unlike the previous game, this time I got my mana under me, caught right back up, and over the course of an hour, won a pretty textbook game of Forget the Fish. My opponent didn't offer a handshake, though, and instead scoffed and said, "Oh, well, I guess we could just not play the game." Again, I want to be a little empathetic. I don't expect anyone to be at their best after a disappointing loss, and I think they took victory for granted while I was still mulliganing. But at the end of the day, again, this was advertised as a competitive event. I followed the rules of Magic and obeyed all laws of all jurisdictions I was in, and even many I wasn't. I know from conversations with this tournament's organizers that our strategy was completely unexpected and something they would at least talk about to decide if these play patterns are good for the format. The tournament's head judge, whose name is Dandân, if you'd believe it, immediately floated the idea of replacing the deck's 2 copies of Temple of Epiphany with Thundering Falls, and maybe adding Shifting Borders to give the traditional strategy a way to break through. But as I record this audio in late May of 2025, there is an identical Forgetful Fish Qualifiers event at MagicCon Las Vegas at the end of June, using an identical deck list. It seems they haven't decided what to do about this yet, and are either hoping that Forget the Fish is forever forgotten, or are simply waiting for more data. And it's not lost on me how much effort tournament organizers put into compiling what must be around 100 identical decks. Even a small change would require compiling hundreds of copies of whichever cards and some billable hours for unsleeving and re-sleeving. It's obviously easier to use what's already been built. My hope in making this video is that word will get out about Forget the Fish, and that it might become generally known that players might run into this strategy in a competitive environment. I suspect that would have spared me some amount of salt earlier this year, and I'm also wildly curious what the Dandân metagame might look like with more players trying this. It was certainly a great strategy when none of my opponents knew it was even possible, but I'm curious if there's effective counterplay that we simply didn't solve. And like I said before, we were learning on the fly. Hopefully, others will build on our work. I'm not going to MagicCon Las Vegas. Conventions, they're fun and everything, but a cabin weekend with my friends seemed a little less unhinged than 2 MagicCons within 6 months. I'm spilling all my secrets here, though, in hopes that I can impact the tournament from afar. I've made my case. I have given you the tools for success. It really only takes one of you to take this to heart, take some time to practice, and I don't know, maybe take this thing down. I don't expect the tournament Dandân list to remain the same forever, but I hope that tournament organizers see fit not to nerf this strategy out of existence. I will be disappointed if Forget the Fish is ultimately treated as an oversight and not a testament to the richness of Magic's weirdest format. We need a tournament metagame to actually flesh this out, but my hypothesis is that Tournament Dandân will be at its best when the official list is tuned for balance and tension between wins by damage and wins by decking. After publishing this video, I look forward to drawing from your wisdom in the comments and drafting an altered Dandân deck list with goals of embracing and better hinting at Forget the Fish as a viable strategy, while also offering new ways for players of the traditional strategy to break out of the lock. In the meantime, if anyone manages to pilot this strategy to a strong finish in Las Vegas, I will fly to where you live and shake your hand. Good luck.